Okay, thank you. And our next panelist, Erik Molvar, is a wildlife biologist and executive director of Western Watersheds Project, a nonprofit conservation group working to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. His scientific publications include both peer-reviewed journal articles and white papers on moose ecology and behavior, wildlands networks, minimizing the environmental effects of energy production, and effects of invasive weeds on land health. He is also the author of 17 guidebooks to public lands.
So anyway, science is objective, uniformly so, without bias. We use deductive reasoning, where we test hypotheses and come to conclusions based on the results. We don't use inductive reasoning, in which we start with a conclusion and then try and find support for that. At least that's what I was told when I was being trained as a graduate student. And I did practice that and published under those traditions, and so I know it's possible, but your results may vary. So we're going to start our little tour here with Rob Roy Ramey III, who is a consultant who was hired by Governor Freudenthal of Wyoming in 2004 when the state of Wyoming was petitioning to delist the Preble's meadow jumping mouse from the endangered species threatened list. And Rob Roy Ramey was tasked to do a genetic analysis of the Preble's meadow jumping mouse. And he did this, and he looked at museum specimens of Preble's meadow jumping mouse and Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse, and he was able to determine that, lo and behold, they were the same subspecies. So the Preble's meadow jumping mouse was not a legitimate subspecies, buttressing the state's argument that it was okay to go ahead and delist the subspecies. And he published this study in a peer-reviewed journal that was, whose publisher was a friend of his. It was a third-tier journal, but it did go through peer review and was published, and then became part of the scientific canon. But then things got interesting, because in 2005, when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to delist the Preble's meadow jumping mouse, the USGS undertook a second review of Dr. Ramey's findings on genetics. And a fellow by the name of Tim King of USGS did his own separate genetic study of exactly the same study skins, exactly the same specimens with exactly the same genetics. And he produced an article that showed that, lo and behold, there were major significant differences between the Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse and the Preble's mouse, and these were different subspecies. So now you have a scientific controversy, and one of the principles of science is that you're supposed to be repeatable. So then what happened was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service convened a blue ribbon panel to adjudicate the difference between these two disparate genetic studies. And what they found was that Dr. Ramey's genetic study had evidence of contamination. In other words, Ramey had Bear Lodge meadow jumping mouse genetic material mixed in with his genetic samples for Preble's. Now, I was down there in Fort Collins for this genetics panel, and they did not say that there are two possible reasons that this outcome could happen. One reason is gross incompetence on the part of Rob Roy Ramey, contaminating his samples. The other possibility is cooking the books, that he intentionally contaminated his samples in order to get the result that he wanted. I can't tell you which one is the reality, because that goes to Ramey's intent, which we cannot crawl in his head and know. But we do know it was either gross incompetence, we do know that it was either cooking the books, and we do know that the Preble's meadow jumping mouse is a legitimate subspecies now. And that delisting that did ultimately happen in 2007 in Wyoming, because the Fish and Wildlife Service ruled that the threats were lower there than Colorado, was then reversed by federal court. And now the Preble's meadow jumping mouse is not only a legitimate subspecies, but protected in both Wyoming and Colorado. The next example that I have for you today comes from the offices of Karen Launchbaugh at the University of Idaho in the Ag School. And this is an article that was by Molly Cowick and Launchbaugh. It comes out of Cowick's master's thesis. And it was looking at the comparative impacts of cattle and wild horses on riparian vegetation in the Owyhee country. And what they found in this study was that wild horses have a pretty significant impact on riparian function, about the same as the impacts of cattle. But what they did not really hide very well was their methods. And in their methods, it states, site selection was based on the recommendations from local BLM professionals and ranchers, accessibility for researchers, and known animal use. So instead of taking a random sample and sampling along the riparian corridor randomly for wild horse use and cattle use, they asked the BLM and the ranchers, where should we sample? Well, there are two possible outcomes here. Either innocently, the BLM and the ranchers want you to come up with some data on both cattle and wild horses and point you to the places you're most likely to find wild horses, or cynically, they say, we know that wild horses come to water at the same place over and over again. We're going to have you sample at the place where the wild horses come to water so you get a magnified look at the impacts to riparian vegetation. And so either way, you have a major source of bias. And one of the underlying assumptions of the statistical models that get used is that you have random sampling so that you do not bias your results. They have violated the assumptions of the model. They have statistics here that are completely invalid. And you have peer reviewers that passed on this and let this go through. And you have Karen Launchbaugh, who is a PhD grad student advisor who is failing this most basic scientific tenet of statistics. So that's pretty problematic and undermines all of the findings of this study, both those that you like and those that you don't. I mean, they also found that wild horses were correlated with more native wildlife. That too is an invalid finding because the statistics here are not supported. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Peter Coates. Peter Coates has been a long and winding road for us environmentalists, starting with the bi-state sage grouse. And back in 2014, Coates did a study where he looked at a subset of the bi-state populations and found that, gee, they're pretty stable. So they're not declining, therefore we might not need to list. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based on this study, decided to deny listing in 2015 of the bi-state distinct population segment of sage grouse. Well, we hauled this finding into court and we put Peter Coates' study on trial. And the judge found that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services themselves recognized that this model had questionable validity, that he had deliberately ignored several of the populations where the sage grouse were declining in coming to the conclusion that they were stable. So in other words, he basically cherry-picked those populations that had a stable population trend, ignoring those populations where the bi-state population was declining, and the court caught him at it and reversed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's finding. And so then, of course, next, Peter Coates did an update on his bi-state population model, indicating that there was really no evidence of increasing or decreasing trend, taking into account all of the different subpopulations of the subspecies or of the DPS, and looking at different windows. But then again, we took that finding to court, and the judge ruled that the service did not explain how this new 2020 Coates study squared those findings with a fairly high extirpation risk. So it doesn't matter if your populations are really, really low but stable. If you're at risk of extinction, that's what the ESA requires. So Coates was once again not able to get the state of Nevada off the hook for listing the bi-state sage grouse. And then, of course, in 2024, now, based on the rulings, one of the rulings was that the voluntary conservation actions that were being undertaken for the bi-state weren't reliable, weren't adequate regulatory mechanisms because they couldn't be proven to be effective. And now Peter Coates has put out a study showing that the local voluntary conservation efforts indeed are correlated with improved performance for populations of bi-state sage grouse. So this is an ongoing running battle that we've been in with Dr. Coates of the USGS, and he seems to have a bit of an agenda here. But his agenda also extends to wild horses. And then recently we had a study where he brought out a paper saying that sage grouse population dynamics were being negatively affected by wild horse presence, and he was basically using the trend of how far above appropriate management level the wild horse populations were in order to make the argument that more wild horses means less sage grouse. What he didn't look at in this study was looking at the impacts of domestic livestock, which are grazing exactly the same habitats. That is a glaring scientific error, one that was pointed out by Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. I also weighed in on this. And when Dr. Coates, and let me see if I can do this because, oops. Is there a way for me to start the video here? Okay, so if I hit the space bar, did it work? No. Go back into that slide. Okay. Still no?
This is
Well, somebody had done it. I had some assistance and somebody had done it, so let's go ahead and.
this is Pete.
Well, we're not going to have the video, unfortunately.
So we do have a proposal in that's going to extend the Wyoming project based out of Fort, looking at cattle and horses and potentially the interaction between the two. This is Pete Coates.
So thank you very much. I appreciate that. So there's Pete Coates telling us that next time we're going to look at cows.
This is Pete Coates.
Oops. And here's next time in the Wyoming study, where once again they found that free roaming horses have a negative effect on sage grouse. Once again, they did not look at the livestock after all that. So here we have, I think, a clear case of a researcher wanting to prove a point without kind of allowing the public to see that there is a much bigger overriding factor that is a negative impact on the sage grouse. Now, another Peter Coates publication here argues that free-roaming horses disrupt greater sage grouse lekking activity in the Great Basin. And the nugget here is a quote from the study: "We only observed one event in which horses flushed sage grouse, but knowing that horses were near other leks, we surmised that similar events occurred outside of the lek count observation period for vacant leks, or that the presence of horses discouraged sage grouse from occupying the lek." So in other words, they have one data point where a horse flushed a sage grouse off a lek, and from that one data point, where you can have no variance, where you can have no mean even, they have an article titled "Free Roaming Horses Disrupt Greater Sage Grouse Lekking." This is the degree of bias that we're talking about here. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Gunnison sage grouse. This is another species I've worked on over the years, and talk about a Utah State University professor by the name of Terry Messmer. And here is the PhD dissertation of Phoebe Prather, which looked at Gunnison sage grouse in San Juan County, Utah. Very interesting PhD dissertation. And buried in this PhD dissertation is the following table. And what I want folks to, and I'm not going to be able to move the cursor, I don't think, here, but what I want you to look at here is grass height along the top here, the top right. You look at grass height, you look at occupied and unoccupied leks, or occupied and unoccupied nesting habitat. And what you'll see is the perennial grass height. The average occupied grass height is 23 centimeters. The average unoccupied grass height is 15 centimeters. The magic threshold is 18 centimeters, 7 inches. That is the scientifically derived grass height at which sage grouse thrive. This study shows 95% confidence intervals that the unoccupied nesting habitats are all below 7-inch grass height. The occupied are all above 7-inch grass height. There's a 95% confidence interval that doesn't overlap and doesn't overlap with 7 inches, which means that they have a statistically significant result here. And that statistically significant result shows that 7-inch grass height is the threshold for Gunnison sage grouse. This is a sin of omission because this is a researcher who did not want to contradict the Colorado State Rangewind Conservation Plan saying that you only need 4 inches of grass height for Gunnison sage grouse. And then, of course, later on, Terry Coates was actually arrested and convicted for fraud. He defrauded his university on travel funds. Now, finally, I want to talk about a lawsuit that we brought against the Hammonds in southeastern Oregon, in which Dwight and Steve Hammond were convicted of felony arson on public lands. They were sent to prison. President Trump, during the first administration, released them. During his last action as Secretary of Interior, Ryan Zinke gave them their permit back after taking jurisdiction of their IBLA appeal. So we filed a lawsuit to block the Hammonds from getting their grazing permit back, and this became a battle of the experts. And we brought experts to the fore. We brought Dr. Clayton Braun, showing that sage grouse are negatively impacted by livestock grazing. The BLM biologist came aboard, and he countered and said he wouldn't expect grazing in this area to affect sage grouse habitat in any way, shape, or form. But on cross-examination by our attorney, he conceded and admitted that livestock grazing can make habitat less suitable for sage grouse. So this is something that you can do in the courtroom that you couldn't get in the scientific universe. Because in science, you have one idea that gets published, you have a counter idea that gets counter-published, you can go back and forth forever, there's no resolution. When you have a court case, there's a judge that rules at the end of the day and says, this evidence is credible, this evidence is not credible. On impacts to livestock, on riparian habitats and trout, we had Dr. Boone Kaufman testifying all kinds of different impacts on trout. We had Lindsay Davies, a BLM planner, arguing that all of the streams in this area were passing their riparian function, so there couldn't be any impacts on trout. And then in terms of cheatgrass and fire, we had Clayton Braun arguing that, hey, grazing increases cheatgrass, that increases fire risk. We had the BLM biologist countering that livestock grazing would actually reduce the fine fuels. This is one of the big fake news narratives the BLM likes these days. And they brought in the head of the agriculture department at University of Nevada, Reno, Tamsin Stringham, who basically testified that abusive grazing is a thing of the past, something we no longer do, and that livestock grazing can be used to reduce cheatgrass, and it really isn't a problem. And so in the end, the judge ruled on our preliminary injunction and granted that preliminary injunction, stating that there were irreparable harms on sage grouse from grazing, on riparian areas for grazing, on cheatgrass from grazing, and we won the battle of the experts. And this is a rare instance where a judge basically adjudicates a scientific controversy. And you too can do this if you bring a motion for preliminary injunction, because that allows you to bring in evidence from outside the administrative record. So in sum, I will say all scientific studies and experts are not created equal. Many scientific studies are objective and unbiased, but not all. And peer review doesn't always clean up the mess. You're going to have political hacks masquerading as unbiased scientists, and they are going to be having their own good old boy networks, their own favorite journals, their peer reviewers who might be friendly to them, who are going to let them get away with it. And so it's important to read scientific studies with a critical eye and question any dubious assumptions. Thank you.